Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. This episode is a really special one for me. I am talking to the legendary design and architecture writer, Karrie Jacobs. Karrie probably does not need an introduction, but as a quick survey, she's been writing about design, architecture, urbanism since the early 90s for publications like Metropolis, the New York Times, Home and Garden, ID, and Curbed. She was the architecture critic at New York Magazine, founding editor-in-chief of Dwell Magazine, and with Tibor Kalman, she was the founding executive editor of Colors. And then, in addition to all of that, she teaches in SVA's Design Research and Criticism program. In this episode, Karrie and I go all the way back to her earliest sort of writing memories, writing for her college paper with Matt Groening, who, of course, would go on to create The Simpsons. We talk about how she started writing about graphic design and architecture, what it was like launching Dwell magazine, and her experiences working with Tibor Kalman on Colors magazine, as well as the great AIGA lecture, Good History, Bad History, that she wrote for Kalman with Abbott Miller. And then we also talk about how the profession has changed over the course of her career, how the kind of understanding of design writing has grown in the interest in that, and how she's kind of navigated that. As I think you'll hear listening to this, I really love Karrie's writing, and her work has been foundational in my own design education, whether it was with Dwell or her work with Tibor. So it was so great to hear stories of her early career before design writing or criticism were really even defined as disciplines. So I am so grateful to have had this time and honored to share this very fun conversation with the great Karrie Jacobs. You've been someone that I've wanted to talk to for a while. You've been this kind of recurring character that has come up again and again, and I've been reading your work for years, at least, since I was in high school and was kind of discovering all of these things. But I don't actually know much about how you got into any of this.
Okay.
And so I kind of wanted to start, just to frame all of this, it's kind of a two-part question, is kind of where your interest in writing or wanting to be a writer came from, and then specifically kind of architecture and design and urbanism, where that interest came from.
Well, I have been told recently that writing is genetic, that there is something in the Jacobs clan that compels us to be writers. And certainly my father, who was in the garment industry, mostly making really crappy ski jackets, really valued the profession and thought that being a writer was kind of the greatest thing you could be. And he was always submitting anecdotes to Reader's Digest magazine, things like that. So I'm not sure, I'm not sure I bought it, but eventually it happened. Really, somewhere between maybe my second and third year of college, I started taking. Actually, I know. I went to this hippie college in the state of Washington called Evergreen, which is lately famous as a hotbed of humorless leftism. And it always has been actually a hotbed of humorless leftism, but it wasn't a national issue till recently. I won't go into that. But I was doing some writing there, and I went to this cultural event at Seattle Center in Seattle, and one of the workshops at this cultural event was for women writers, and someone gave a talk about how women don't take themselves seriously when they do things. They say, oh, it's just a hobby, and there was an assignment in this workshop that you had to write a note for the refrigerator door. And I wrote this sort of rhyming note, and I thought, God, this is better than anything anyone else did. Maybe I should take myself seriously. So I think that's when I decided to be a writer.
So what were you thinking career-wise before that happened, or what were you interested in?
Well, this was the 70s, and I don't think people thought career-wise
Okay.
so much back then. I don't think it's like it is now. I had thought originally that I wanted to be a filmmaker, and then I found out how much it costs to make movies.
Yeah.
I went to, one college film class, and the whole class was about the price of raw film and how much you would use how much you would go through relative to how much you actually would need in the movie.
Right.
And I did the math and realized I just couldn't afford to do that.
Yeah.
And again, that would be very different now. And, I don't think I really knew, but I started writing, and I wrote a couple of things for the college newspaper.
Okay.
And this guy I knew took over as the editor of the college newspaper and hired his best male friends as his sub-editors, and one of them got really angry at him and left in a huff. And he called me. And so I wrote for the college newspaper. The editor in question is Matt Groening, who went on to do The Simpsons.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
So that's sort of a weird... so my college newspaper situation was, in retrospect, kind of unusual.
That's crazy, actually.
Most of the people who I went to college with who have become at all famous are famous as cartoonists.
Yeah.
So in that office, the guy who did the pasted up the ads was Charles Burns.
I know that name.
Who is also a cartoonist. He did a version, he worked with, Mark Morris on a version of the Nutcracker.
Oh, this sounds familiar, yeah.
I think he's in Philly, or he was in Philly.
Okay.
And then the other person who was a regular in the office, mostly to come in and annoy us, was Lynda Berry.
Oh, wow.
So,
okay.
And I'm not sure, what any of that means, but that was...
Yeah.
So the person I sort of really got serious about writing with was Matt Groening, because, we were, staying up all night.
Yeah.
Trying to write, the new journalism. That was, very much the thing. There was, there was this compendium, which was probably called The New Journalism, of, articles from, New York Magazine and Tom Wolfe stories that we would, study.
Yeah.
And so that's when I became a writer.
This is this raises all these other questions that I was not planning on asking you about, but I just kind of want to parse this out a little bit, because it's kind of amazing.
Parse away.
I'm interested, I'm very curious about, and you started touching on this a little bit, but kind of that writing experience and what type of writing you were trying to do. Was humor and satire, was that, or was it kind of journalism, or what was...
Both. I mean, because I was low on the totem pole, I was sent off to do, cover the budget hearings in the legislature, which would affect our tuition, and write about that.
Right.
And, but then I also wanted to write the funny piece about the demonstration that happened at the state legislature, and to, review the Robert Altman movie that, just came out. And I, after a while, just said, look, I can't just do the news stories. I need to have some fun, too.
Okay.
And once I said that, that was, fine.
And so what type of, what type of stories were you doing then when you kind of got that permission, or how did your writing change when you started to break out of just strict news?
Well, I guess it was, somewhere there's a pile of per-point journals.
Right.
But, I don't know, just, I guess, more adjectives, more first person, more making fun of things.
Right.
What Matt was doing, I'm not sure how many actual articles he was writing. He wrote a little column in the back called The Stuffed Albino Squirrel, which was
all right.
sort of this story, I guess,
that
involved a stuffed albino squirrel. I can't really remember the details. And he was sort of cartooning in a very non-serious way, like he'd leave a note for you about, the fact that he'd be back later, and there would be like this goofy rabbit
Okay.
with big teeth, who I think was a parody of his best friend Brad.
Okay.
And that sort of became
This
one
is
of
crazy.
his first, that sort of became his life in hell character.
Yeah.
So, at that point, I assumed that what I would do professionally would be a writer. And, and then Matt sort of went off to LA and worked in a Xerox shop
Okay. Yeah.
for a while.
Okay. So, where did the interest in architecture come in, or writing about the built environment?
Architecture, for the most part, didn't come till later.
Okay.
But, it's weird because the very first professional article I did out of college, there was a newspaper, a weekly alternative newspaper called the Seattle Sun.
Okay, yeah.
And I, went there with my clips from my college newspaper, and they were doing a special issue on the future of Seattle.
Okay.
And either they suggested or I suggested that I would find whatever plans had been done for the future of Seattle. And
oh, interesting.
And so I wrote this piece about how, there was one plan that involved moving sidewalks to take people up the hills. And, I just sort of found all this wacky stuff that had been proposed that had, probably would never be done. And then the Future of Seattle issue came out, and it wasn't in there. And I was, heartbroken, and didn't talk to them, didn't call them. And a couple of weeks later, all of a sudden, my article was the cover story. And it was just that they had decided it was so good that it could stand on its own. But they didn't tell me that.
Okay.
And then, but after that, I don't think I wrote anything that was particularly about architecture or urbanism, for a long time.
Oh.
I wrote about rock and roll primarily.
Okay. So, and I want to think kind of how to phrase this. So it's interesting to me that you kind of just fell in, you were just kind of assigned that piece.
Yeah, I guess they must have assigned it, because I don't know if I would have known to look for that stuff. I have no idea how that happened. It's sort of weird.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. It was just sort of a fluky thing that I, forgot about.
And then I'll be completely honest. I don't know anything about your writing about music. What was that type of?
Well, what happened was this was the late 70s, early 80s, and so it was sort of the beginning. It was sort of the punk rock era, and every city all of a sudden had to have its music magazine. And so this supplement, this thing called The Rocket, started as a supplement to the Seattle Sun.
Okay.
And someone I knew, I think it was like maybe Lynda Berry's boyfriend, said, "Oh, you should come to a meeting. We're doing this magazine. You should write for it." And so I went to a meeting, and I got assigned some stories and wrote some stories. And by that point, I think I was working at a record store in the U District, and they said, "Oh, well, since you're working at a record store in the U District, why don't you write an essay about the future?" It was about to become 1980.
Okay,
so like what rock and roll, what music will be in the future, meaning the 80s.
Interesting.
And so I wrote this essay, and it was sort of about the idea that, world music would happen and all these other things, but the main thrust of it was that, that rock stars were going to begin to die of old age, in the future. That it would be rock stars until they're very old, and I think turned out to be
I was going to say, that sounds actually pretty close to what happened.
So it was a pretty good essay, and it was funny, and and so they said, "Well, why don't you become one of the editors, because you seem to know what you're doing, and we'll guarantee you like $100 a month."
Okay.
and,
nice.
And so like that, I became a senior editor of The Rocket.
Okay.
And the Seattle Sun was failing financially, which was a long story. And somebody had access. There's two different stories about where the money came from, but somehow someone came up with $10,000. Not me, for sure.
Okay.
Either the guy who was the editor-in-chief won it at poker, which is what he claims, or the guy who was the publisher's family ponied it up, which seems more likely to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, all of a sudden there was $10,000, and we used it to liberate ourselves from the Seattle Sun and become an independent publication.
Okay.
And so I wrote a lot about music, but I also wrote about what I was beginning to describe as the underpinnings of popular culture. That was my description for what I was doing.
Okay.
So, for example, the first American outpost of Nintendo was based in the suburbs of Seattle, and I, went and talked to them and had them try and explain to me, why Pac-Man looks the way he does.
Right.
And I began to write articles that were about design, although I don't think I thought of it as design. And my best friends, at the Rocket and elsewhere, tended to be the graphic designers. And magazine production at the time involved staying up all night the night before you went to the printer and putting wax on the back of things and physically laying out pages. And so I did that a lot. And so I was kind of in a design culture. And then I got hired. I got tired of the Rocket, and when the editor-in-chief who started it quit to take a job in Orange County.
Okay.
It was between the two senior editors, and it became very obvious that our male publisher and his male sidekick much preferred the male editor.
Yeah.
And there was a lesson I learned there that
I bet
has stuck with me to this day. But I took a job. I got offered a job as the Suntracks editor, the music editor of New Times Weekly in Phoenix.
Okay.
And I thought, okay, I'll go do this weird thing.
So I have two questions kind of from that story. The first one is about the music again, and it's kind of the type of writing you were doing, or what being a music editor meant. Were you writing album reviews? Was this kind of more like that future of music type?
Well, everything. My position, the thing I was editing specifically was the stories I was editing the live music coverage, and I was trying to make it so that we covered local bands as much as we covered national acts, and that we covered local bands that actually did their own material as opposed to cover bands, and trying to sort of push this sort of music revolution that was in progress forward as best I could. And so sometimes I was writing about live music. It's like U2 came through town on their first U.S. tour, and they played in some tiny little club. I wrote about that. Sometimes I was doing interviews, sometimes I was doing album reviews, but sometimes I was doing, features that were, I did a feature about, like, the war in Nicaragua. I did a feature about, abortion rights. So I did.
So you were still doing a lot of different...
I did whatever I felt like doing. And whatever I felt like doing. I went to a, Miss Teen beauty pageant and wrote about that. I drove all over, sort of the suburbs and went and saw every lounge act.
That's great. I love that.
So it was a great situation. It was a situation in which I could do whatever I wanted to do. But I don't know, maybe at a certain point we were making like, $300 or $400 a month. Toward the end of every month, my boyfriend and I would walk around Seattle Center by the Space Needle and look for money that people dropped on the ground. So it was, so the job offer in Phoenix was, I wouldn't have to look for money people dropped on the ground anymore. And they said they'd lease me a car. And I thought, okay, I'll do this.
That's interesting.
And Phoenix was shocking.
I bet.
Because it's a whole different culture. And I think that's probably when I began to think about cities. And how they're put together.
That was going to be my next question, because I was curious about, I wanted to come back to and if I'm jumping around a little bit, correct me, but I was curious about the Pac-Man story and kind of talking about how you were kind of around design or in this design kind of culture, but not realizing. I'm curious if there's kind of a moment where that suddenly came into focus the way kind of that writing workshop in college, you know.
Well, what happened again at the New Times in Phoenix, which was it was an enormous weekly paper then, and they hadn't. Sometime after that, they bought up like every other weekly newspaper in the country, and that's a whole other story.
Yeah.
But it was a very central feature of life in Phoenix. Anyway, my deal with them was I would edit the music section, but I could write whatever I felt like writing. Okay. So I didn't write about music that much there. And I started writing about, I did a piece, like, for example, about neon, about the fact that upscale communities like Scottsdale absolutely banned neon, but on the other hand, there was this emerging culture of collecting.
Oh, interesting.
And I'm just trying to think about what else. I don't know, I did a story about the culture of happy hours. I don't know, I did all kinds of crazy stuff. I did a thing about, this was sort of a music story, about ASCAP and BMI, which, collect money for music performance rights and then distribute them badly, and sort of about how they were cracking down on laundromats and their sound systems.
Oh, interesting.
They were going to like the smallest venues to collect money, but when they distributed money, it mostly went to the biggest players. Yeah. And so I did, some serious reporting. I did some, essays. I did, whatever I wanted to do. And I was supposed to do 2 of these big alternative weekly features a month. And at that time, we were still talking typewriters, not computers. And I have no idea how I did that, except that I was always in trouble for turning in stories late. And, anyway, so I did that for about 2 years, and by the end of that 2 years, now we're getting to about 1984. My boyfriend, who was a graphic designer and an artist from Seattle, moved to New York, and I was, scheduled to meet him, and I got there a few months late. But I eventually moved to New York, and I knew by that point that I did not want to write about music anymore. I was just, sick of rock stars. I was sick of, talking to people in the industry. I wanted nothing to do with it. And so the thing that I thought I might be able to do was write about advertising. And the first thing I did was I approached, Ad Age, which was based in Chicago, part of the Cranes empire, and sent them some clips, and they started assigning me stories, and so I started doing stories for them. And then I found out through some friends. At this point, we had there was the Seattle Mafia. A lot of people who I worked with in Seattle had moved to New York and were either for a while were the art department of the East Village Eye. And I was for about 2 days I was the features editor of the East Village Eye, but I just hated it. And people just kept on handing in these horrible articles that I kept on hiding in desk drawers. They were so bad.
That's amazing.
So I didn't last very long. Anyway, and then the Village Voice kind of got inundated, mostly with art directors from the Rocket. And a few photographers, and anyway, so somebody in that network said, well, Clay Felker is now the editor-in-chief of Adweek. Clay Felker being the legendary editor who started New York Magazine. So he was like the god of new journalism. And I called him up, and I said, I write for Ad Age, but I would love to jump ship. And, point of fact, I was nobody. I was like the lowliest. Me jumping ship was no skin off anyone's back. And he invited me in for a meeting and read my resume and talked to me and was nicer than anyone I had met to date, to that point in New York. And probably nicer than almost anyone I met after that. I mean, I was really nobody. And he sat down and talked to me and had, an editor at Adweek start assigning me things.
Oh, wow.
And so I started writing about advertising, and it quickly became clear that my strength was writing about weird stuff. And, so I wrote about, skywriting and
Right.
about, spent a day following a radio consultant around as he consulted with his clients.
Yeah.
And, and some of it was visual stuff. Some of it was, I was really interested in package design, so I wrote about package design from time to time. And in any case, at a certain point, now we're sort of moving into the mid to late 80s. A friend of mine became the art director of this oversized magazine called Metropolis.
Okay.
And told me that there was a job opening there, that one of the associate editors had quit and I should apply. So because I've been writing all these odd articles for a long period of time, I had a great set of design clips, even though I never thought of myself as a design writer. It wasn't, again, the thing, I had sort of moved from saying I was writing about the underpinnings of popular culture to the infrastructure of popular culture.
Oh, interesting.
Okay. And so, I had the thing about the neon, I had the thing about the package designers, I had, I just sort of had this weird, this weird set of clips that taken together looked like what a design writer's set of clips might look like. And by the way, there really wasn't at that moment any such thing as a design writer, really. I mean, there were architecture critics, and then there were maybe some designers who wrote.
Right.
But there really were not, it's not like there is now.
Right, and you weren't really writing about architecture in the traditional sense. It really was more kind of visual culture in a lot of sense, advertising, things like that. So it was this kind of different thing.
Yeah, so, and I came into Metropolis, and had a whole bunch of ideas. Some of them ideas I've been pitching, like an idea about the relationship between package design and garbage.
Okay.
Which, became a cover story for Metropolis. About all these plastic jugs that had started appearing that no one knew what to do with, really.
Yeah.
And, and again, it was like these features that would go on for like 6,000 words.
Yeah.
And God only knows how I did that.
Right.
And, sort of weird concepts, like I was really interested in the idea of convenience.
Yeah.
Like design, how we design the world for this concept, convenience.
Mm-hmm.
I was interested in the idea of transparency and what that might mean. And, in the interest of transparency, do you dumb things down? Do you make things more opaque?
Right, yeah.
And I just sort of had all these, concepts that they were, Susan Sanazi, to her credit, said, okay, fine, go ahead, you do that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like that really hits on what I've always liked about your writing and what has become, I think, kind of my angle in kind of talking to a lot of people, and that so much of design writing, and specifically graphic design writing, is this kind of surface level critique of how something looks.
Yeah.
And this is the example that I use, I feel like, in every conversation that I have of, company X redesigns their logo, and then they talk about, how the typefaces have changed, or the color has changed, or the kerning between the letters have changed. And you've written about things like that, but that never seemed like your interest. And I like that use of kind of the infrastructure of these things. It's kind of how they come into being, and then what happens when they're in the world.
Right.
And that's...
Well, the first feature I wrote for Metropolis was about corporate logos, because it was that moment when corporations were changing their names to be less specific.
Oh, yeah.
So, I guess that, U.S. Steel became USX, and there are a million other examples, but nobody wanted to be known for making a specific thing anymore, because they were pretty sure that specific thing wasn't, wasn't what Wall Street wanted them to be doing.
Right.
And so I did a piece about corporate logos that I interviewed, everyone I could think of. I went and interviewed Michael Beirut when he was, sort of a mid-level designer at Vignelli. And he was very nice and very gracious. And I called up Paul Rand out of the blue.
Oh, wow.
And he said, okay, yeah, come meet me at the Yale Club. That's fine.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing.
And I had Michael at that moment wasn't it. He didn't become a mover and shaker until somewhat later.
Yeah.
Tibor Kalman had just done this piece for ID Magazine about corporate logos, which was sort of about the same general idea, but it was not, not so much a researched or written piece. It was kind of a series of one-liners. And I called him up, and he said, "Well, everything I think is in the article. Look at my article."
Okay.
And so that was the first piece. And the other piece that I think that sort of put me on the map was a piece about type.
Okay.
I was living with a graphic designer. All my friends were still graphic designers. I lived in a very type-centric world.
Right.
And it was sort of at the moment when the technology was changing from photo-based to digital, and everyone was going insane.
Yeah.
And so I went to this conference in which people were just, I don't know, lamenting, a lot of lamenting, a certain amount of arguing, a certain amount of yelling, and it was kind of great because I just wrote this epic feature about what is a typeface and what the materiality or non-materiality of type.
I'm still really amazed, kind of hearing you retell this. How much of an accident some of this feels like that you started writing about these things. Did you ever feel like you were being pigeonholed into writing about these things, or were you very much kind of following your interests at the time? Because
at the point where I started feeling pigeonholed, I sort of changed course.
Okay.
I was really became sort of well known in the graphic design world,
that's kind
especially.
Yeah.
And so I started writing about cities more.
Okay.
I started getting interested in, now we're sort of, a few things happened. One of them, let's see.
Yeah. There are a couple things in your background that I want to make sure we don't gloss over.
Okay, one of the things, at a certain point, I think I was on staff at Metropolis for 2 or 3 years, and then I kind of negotiated a deal with them where I would continue writing all the stuff that I wrote, but I wouldn't have to come to the office anymore. And somewhere in that period, not too long after that happened, there was a lot of back and forth between Tibor Kalman and I.
Okay, I want to talk about this a little bit.
We were sort of, I don't know, shooting flares or something to each other, at each other. There was a certain amount of back and forth.
Okay.
And one day he called me up. Both of us were speaking at this AIGA conference that happened in San Antonio, and I think maybe 1989. Must have been 1989.
Okay.
And let's see, I think Tibor and Milton Glaser were the co-chairs of the conference. Anyway, it was sort of this attempt to make the AIGA conference, in some way radical and relevant.
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
So the talk that you saw, the thing about graphic design and garbage, was my talk.
Right.
Which I spent no time working on because Tibor hired me to ghost his speech.
Right. And was this the Good History Bad?
No, this is prior to that.
Okay.
This is just called Bad.
Okay.
And it's sort of about the idea that everyone can be a good graphic designer now, but the real trick is to be bad.
Okay.
And so, it was sort of full of rhetorical flourish and, and writing it was just a nightmare because I would write a draft and Tibor would say, no, I don't want this. Any place that I actually did what he told me to do, he didn't like.
Right.
And I finally got that idea.
Yeah.
Went back and just sort of wrote the thing that I wanted to write, and that worked better. And that went over very well, and the New York Times reported on his talk, but didn't report on my talk.
Of course.
And again, that was sort of another one of those life lessons.
Yep.
And
I'm sensing some recurring themes happening now.
Yeah. Well.
So did you? I might be mixing things up, but didn't you work on his talk, Good History, Bad History?
Yeah,
also?
that came. Okay, so we went to San Antonio, and whenever that was, I guess it was the summer of 1989, or maybe it was September of 1989. And I ghosted this talk for him. I sat in the audience. I kind of watched them all, the audience just be smitten with Tibor giving this talk, and in some cases mispronouncing words, and and it I don't know. It was sort of like being a playwright.
Yeah.
But kind of an uncredited playwright.
Oh, right, because you're seeing someone else perform almost this thing you worked on.
Yeah, this thing that I wrote. So, the next thing that happens, these guys from Hard Workin' in the Netherlands, who we were friends with, came back to New York, and we spent a day or two running around, and, crossing paths, and at some point, Gerard Hatters, whose name I'm pronouncing very badly because it starts with a Dutch G, and nobody can pronounce a Dutch G except Dutch people. But one of the partners of Hard Workin' and I walked into Tibor's office, and Tibor said, Stephen Heller just asked me to write the keynote, or asked me to give the keynote at his design history conference. Can you write it? And I said, no. No.
Yeah.
Let's see. Yeah, I wasn't going to do it again. And so he got Abbott Miller to write it. And then he sent it to me and said, I don't think this is quite right yet. Can you take a look at this?
Okay.
And I sent him a bunch of notes of here's what you need to do to fix it. Cut out all the modifiers, and try, all the words that you can't pronounce, and all the references you don't get.
Yeah.
And in any case, what happened eventually is that, Tibor took my notes, waited 2 weeks, and then called me again and said, please, can you fix it? So I went through Abbott's draft and rewrote it to sound like Tibor.
Okay. Interesting.
Which is to say, I rewrote it to sound like me, or me writing Tibor.
Right. I mean, I'm asking this purely selfish reasons, because Tibor, like I mentioned before we started recording, growing up as a kind of suburban kid discovering graphic design, Tibor was one of the first designers that I became very aware of, and that Tibor monograph was something that was very important to me at a very young age.
Yeah, I bet.
And specifically that talk, Good History, Bad History, was something that was, very profoundly affected the way I was thinking about design when I was in college. And a good friend of mine and I kind of read it together. And it was like, our design education is like, we're getting messed up. Like, this is wrong. And this is, what Tibor and Karrie and Abbott wrote here is what we were really interested in. So I was always very curious about kind of the origins of that, because it was so seminal to my own kind of understanding of being a designer.
I mean, honestly, I think that the sort of the philosophical underpinnings and many of the examples are Abbott.
Okay.
And then I changed some of the examples because they were just too, I don't know if that's in there. There was a whole thing about a certain Bible, a certain edition of the Bible.
Right, yeah.
It may still be in there.
I should have reread this before I talked to you.
I haven't reread it in a long time. But there were things that I cut out because it didn't seem like Tibor could plausibly be speaking about it. They just seemed wrong.
Huh.
And then, in any case, when he gave the talk originally at Heller's, design history conference, he, for whatever reason, primarily used Paula Scher's work as the visual illustrations of the concepts.
Okay.
And there are a couple of places I think that the piece actually refers to Paula.
Yeah.
But he used a lot of her work, and she was not happy.
Yeah, I bet. I bet.
And I mean, he showed me what he was going to do, and I said, "Why are you doing so much of Paula's work?" And I, to this day, really don't know what what that was about. But yeah, at some point, Paula just came up and made it very clear how she felt.
I can't imagine. It's always interesting to hear these stories as someone who kind of came to all of this stuff after the fact. So I'm always kind of seeing it through a bit of a historical lens. And so someone who was there, it's very interesting of kind of how the dynamics of this change kind of through history.
So anyway, yeah, it was... And then there was a third talk that we actually presented together at the Millennium Conference. And, again, I was the writer, and Tibor was supposed to be doing the visuals, but in fact that was Scott Stoll who did the visuals.
Okay, yeah.
So, Tibor is a complicated subject because he was just a force of nature, and he was very, very good at making things happen and making things happen in bigger and more interesting ways than they otherwise would happen. But in terms of doing the specific work, whether it was design or writing or editing, those were not his. Working with people and, either motivating them sometimes or driving them insane sometimes or a little of both, he was great at. But actually creating things himself, it's sort of a weird...
Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of characters like that out there, and he's...
Yeah, but it's interesting because I feel like you did kind of work with him on a lot of different things and went on to do colors. Were you there from the beginning for that?
Yeah, I was. Okay. I one day was at my office and got a fax slipped under my door because I didn't have my own fax machine. I used the guys down the hall to receive faxes for me. And it was a pie chart, which was 1/3 National Geographic, 1/3 Life magazine, and 1/3 The Face.
Okay.
And this is this magazine that Tibor wanted to know if I was interested in working on.
Okay.
And so at that point, he and Oliviero Toscani had come to New York to find someone to, I think, art direct, actually, a magazine. And someone sent him to see Tibor, and Tibor said, "I want to be the editor."
Okay.
And so sometime after I got the pie chart, on a Saturday, I got a phone call at home saying, come to the office, come talk with us.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went to M & Company on a Saturday afternoon, and there was Oliviero Toscani, and there was Tibor, and we talked about this magazine, and I tried to get them to sort of nail down the offer, like what it was they wanted. I looked at Toscani, and he said, "Why are you looking at me?"
Yeah.
Anyway, the idea was that we were going to do this magazine, and it was going to be for Benetton, and it would be packaged with, a sweater catalog. But it wouldn't be about sweaters. It would be about the world in the broadest, most undefined sense of the word. And Tibor would be the editor, and I was supposed to be something called the assigning editor.
Okay.
And we fought about the title because I was hiring the writers, I was editing, I was coming up with the stories, and we fought about everything. So I wound up being the executive editor, and I don't know, it was 4 issues in 2 years. It was labor-intensive beyond belief. We did things by FedEx and fax and phone that today, of course, you would do, electronically with no effort at all.
Yeah.
We organized, we had sort of teams all over the world who could, go out and buy the local kind of candy and send it to us by FedEx.
I mean, it's so interesting because I feel like that magazine for a lot of graphic designers has become this kind of iconic Tibor. That's for a lot of of younger designers, Tibor is synonymous with colors, and
Right.
you know, that's overshadowed a lot of his other work, I think. And so it's interesting that you were kind of there for that. It was the first 4 issues that you did?
Yeah, I was there at the beginning.
And then I know that we're kind of jumping a little
Right.
bit, but
That's
I do
okay.
want to make sure that we have some time for some other... I don't want to just spend time talking about all this early work, but
Right.
I do want to talk about one other thing in your background that I think connects a little bit to colors, in that I've noticed in talking to you how you've been involved in kind of the beginnings of a lot of publications. And another magazine that was very influential to me as a kid was Dwell,
Yeah.
and which I think started in 2002.
No, it started. We launched in 2000.
Okay.
So I started working on it in 1999.
Okay. And I think I came to it a couple years later, but I was as a high school student, I was a Dwell subscriber. You know, I was that weird kid. So that was something that was also very influential to me. So I'm curious. I don't know if I really have a specific question there, but I'm just curious a little bit about how you got involved with that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's see. After Colors, I did Colors for 2 years, and then I left the country because I didn't want to get sucked back in.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to Berlin for a while.
Okay.
And then I came back from Berlin, and Tibor left the country. He went to Rome.
Right.
So that worked out.
Right. Yeah.
And I didn't really want to write I sort of writing for Metropolis at that point had begun. Well, I did some more work for Metropolis, but it was sort of about how electronic technology was going to affect the shape of cities, and I wrote all these articles in the mid-90s about that subject, which all I think turned out to be basically wrong.
Yeah.
And then I decided, okay, I don't really want to keep on writing for Metropolis anymore, so Kurt Anderson at that point was the editor-in-chief of New York Magazine, and he had fired the guy who had been their architecture critic when he took over. And
wait, so you worked for Kurt also?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Well, he hired me to do an architecture column.
Okay.
Sort of based on a lot of the writing I had been doing about sort of the shape of cities. And so I started doing the front of the book. It was a front of the book column, not an arts column in the back of the book. Okay. And I did that for a few years, but about, I'd say maybe a year in, Kurt got fired. Right. So I worked for Caroline Miller, who was his replacement. Okay. And anyway, this guy Hugo Lindgren, who had been that's sort of more of a journalism reference than a design reference. He had been an intern and then a junior editor at Metropolis. He wound up being my editor at New York Magazine, and then he went on later to be the editor of the New York Times Magazine. Okay. So that's a whole other thread. Right. But yeah, so I worked for Kurt, and yeah, he got canned, which was really a shame because it was pretty cool. Yeah. He's like, I tell people that Kurt Anderson is basically kind of who I want to be when I grow up. In that just kind of the way he seems to operate is something that's very appealing to me. I think between Studio 360 and writing books and sort of odd other things, he seems to be doing, and tweeting. He's a good tweeter. Yes, yeah, he is. Anyway, so we were going to talk about Dwell. Okay. Right. All right. So I started writing this column for New York Magazine, and it was great. It was fun to do. It was hard to do. Right. And I probably could have done that forever, or at least until Adam Moss took over. Right. But I heard that I guess I got headhunted for Dwell. This woman from the West Coast was starting a magazine, and I don't know, I don't even remember if she came to New York to meet with me, or whether I just sort of sent her a package. Okay. But somehow I became one of 2 finalists to edit this magazine, which at the time was called Box. Okay. And so the sort of the final competition for becoming the editor of Box was to plan a special theme issue, do a critique. They had like these editorial consultants who sort of did an outline of what the magazine was supposed to be and what its contents might be.
Mm-hmm.
So to do a critique of their outline and also to plan a themed issue.
Okay.
And my critique of their outline was, okay, you have all these high-minded ideas about doing a magazine about modern design, but the outline you have could be any stupid magazine. It's like he said, she said. And,
oh, interesting.
And I just said, you don't want to do this stuff. This is horrible. It was basically, it was kind of a fuck you.
Right.
Like, I don't really want this job.
Yeah.
I think, you're making some mistakes here. This is what's wrong. And it was, it was not a polite critique. And then the special issue was about the idea of mass-produced housing.
Okay.
So it was about, because I had just interviewed some architects who had this idea that they were going to build houses, they're going to have a boat manufacturer build houses, and it was like this really seductive idea, and once they actually tried to make it happen, it was a disaster. But I had, I had this in my head, so I kind of came up with this idea of doing an issue about mass-produced houses.
Okay. I mean, that's interesting though also, because I feel like that has ended up becoming a large theme of Dwell, or small spaces, mass production.
Yep, prefab.
Yeah.
So the first, so anyway, I got offered the job, and I thought about it for a bit. I decided to take it, which was a surprise to my then boyfriend, because apparently I didn't talk to him about it. Like the fact that I was moving to San Francisco, I had somehow neglected to tell him.
Oh, that was you were moving for that job also?
Yeah, I moved.
Okay.
I did the stupidest thing you could ever do, which is I sold my New York apartment, moved to San Francisco, and I spent about 3 years out there, about a year of startup, and then I ran the magazine for about 2 years. And the first, I had to put the mass-produced houses back a couple of issues because the publisher thought it was not, shelter booky enough.
Yeah.
And when we did the first prefab issue, which is I think the third issue of Dwell ever, the cover line was, prefab is pretty fabulous, which has been done a million times since then, but I think that was the first time. And her cover consultant, who is the bane of my existence, said that we should make the word prefab smaller because it was too trade. And of course, that sold incredibly well.
Yeah.
And people were really interested in the idea.
Karrie, I want to start to kind of connect this a little bit to, because we're still, 15 years ago, and I don't want this whole thing to be talking about 15 years ago or more, but I want to use that story actually to kind of connect it to kind of the current day and maybe talk about some larger questions I have around the design discourse, because it's interesting to me that how many of the subjects you were writing about have now become kind of popular topics to write about. Yeah. And so, you've kind of been consistently writing, and you've written, we've mentioned them, the New York Times and ID Magazine, I think you've written for, and, all of these publications. How has the discourse around design or the built world changed in those last kind of 20 years?
When I was starting out, it's not that there wasn't discourse, it just wasn't popular discourse.
Right.
There was professional discourse. Design got discussed by designers at design conferences and in, design publications that nobody but designers read.
Yeah.
And at a certain point, design officially became not the underpinnings of popular culture or the infrastructure of popular culture, but popular culture.
Yeah.
And, I think that's a function of blogging and the, I should be able to think of what the seminal moment was when that transition happened, but some of it has to do with starchitecture and some of it, but there was just a moment where a new corporate logo, would be the occasion for this, mass pile-on online.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, a lot of the obscure stuff that I used to write about isn't obscure anymore and is of general interest.
Did that change how maybe your own writing process or the subjects you're interested in writing about, or how you write about these subjects, knowing that there's greater interest in it? Have you found yourself wanting to write about more obscure things, or change how you're writing about these things now knowing people like it?
I don't know. I still seem to be solidly obscure.
Right.
I mean, I don't even though there's more. In some way, like I wrote for Travel and Leisure for a long time, until the woman who was the editor, that's a whole other story, but she left and everyone I knew got, either quit or got fired. But that was a context in which I could write about design in a really mainstream way,
Right.
sort of design as travel, or travel,
Yeah.
design as a reason to go to a particular place.
Right.
And I liked that because travel stories are by definition sort of amorphous and pointless, and it was a way to write travel stories and the editor I worked with was really good at, sort of the conceptual assignments. So he would call up and say, "Can you do something about the city of the future?"
Yeah.
And I'd say, "Yeah, sure."
Right.
And, and then I'd sort of try and figure out what the city of the future might mean right now and whether there was one that I could actually visit. And for a while, during the recession, I anointed myself the airport critic.
Okay.
Because they were trying to run Travel and Leisure off of inventory, off of stories they had assigned but had never run. And I thought, well, if I was doing something that was service-oriented and that, was a column, then they would have to,
Yeah.
That didn't work as well as I would have liked. I did maybe 3 airport critic columns, but I sort of became the airport expert.
Yeah.
Writing about airports is really interesting.
Yeah.
Because it's, both sexy,
right,
and also really complicated, and there's a lot of nuts and bolts.
Yeah.
So, but a lot of what is desirable in a mainstream story about design isn't the stuff I'm interested in.
Right.
And I don't know, I just go through phases of being interested in things. I've been writing a lot for Curb.com about the concept of engineered nature.
Right.
And I'm thinking there might be a book in that. I'm not sure. I've been writing since the election for Architect magazine about things that were done under Obama that affected the design of cities or places that are being eliminated. Like I'm sort of trying to, illuminate, sort of the parts of the federal government that are actually important to architects and planners, and so I've been doing that.
I recently talked to Jeff Maynaw from Building Blog. Do you know his work?
Sure.
And we talked about something very similar in how, it's interesting, you could put a design lens on subjects that might not necessarily be seen as design.
Right.
Or, we've gotten, or kind of the inverse, we've gotten to this place in society where, almost everything has been designed, which is why I think, you're writing about kind of engineered environments or engineered nature.
Right.
Suddenly, things that seem organic are design issues or policy issues, if it's, the things you're writing about for architecture.
My one-liner about why I write about design is that I'm really a generalist, but I was told that I needed to specialize.
Right.
And so writing about design is a way to pretend that you're a specialist without ever really specializing.
Yeah, I love that.
So that's I used to give that explanation a lot. I hadn't thought about it recently.
No, that's actually a really great answer, because someone who's also very fundamental to how I think about my work as a designer and as someone who talks to design writers is Mark Wigley, and he has this recent book, Are We Human?, which he wrote with Beatrix Calomina about kind of.
It was for a biennial.
It was for their biennial, and then they published this book, but they have this line in it that listeners of the podcast are probably going to get tired of hearing me say, because I quote it I feel like I quote this in every interview, is that the whole globe has been encrusted with a geological layer of design, and that we can't escape the effects of design anymore, which is very much what you were just talking about.
Right.
And that design has become this almost generalist thing where you can kind of write about anything with that kind of lens.
Yeah, no, it's like I'm currently reading this old Moshe Safdie book, which is actually a much older book, in which he's sort of it's basically the oral history of habitat.
Oh, okay.
Because I'm writing a piece about habitat right now, and I was up there and actually went inside apartments for the first time, but I was walking in. I'd been there once before, and there's sort of this hollow underbelly to habitat that you walk through, and it's the most undesigned place. It's really weird. I mean, apartment complexes today are like hyper landscaped. That like a famous architect's apartment building would be, and there is some landscaping around it, but this underside that is kind of the main street in a way, there are birds nesting in the crevices, and it's kind of a little bit ghostly, and it's beautiful. It's just beautiful, but nobody has really messed with it.
Right.
And it just made me think about how designed environments are these days. So
I'm curious how we've touched on this a little bit, but I'm curious how you think about audience for your writing, and especially how that's changed in thinking about how this has become a kind of popular subject in a lot of ways. Do you have kind of an imagined audience, or kind of who are you writing for? Who are your readers?
I guess the short answer is I have no idea.
Okay.
I mean, I've always written things based on what's interesting to me at any given moment, and and my ability to convince somebody, some publication, some editor, that whatever it is I'm interested in would be interesting to someone else. At Metropolis, particularly early, I had two different periods of working for Metropolis, one in the 80s, and then when I came back from Dwell in the early 2000s, I started doing a column, which I did actually for a decade. And in early Metropolis, I always felt like I probably personally knew every single reader. The circulation of Metropolis was not that big, and it was really limited to the design world. But in the second version, because the columns were online, there was a much larger and less predictable audience.
Okay.
And some of those people would still be designers or planners or whoever. But the only way I really can gauge it, I kind of look at who retweets or tweets my pieces. With Curbed, there are probably more people in the real estate industry.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess that makes sense, but it's always a little surprising to me. But, all kinds of people. I don't know. I mean, I guess I know you're supposed to think about audience, and when you sell a book, you wind up having a conversation that's part of the process of, proposing a book, as you say, oh, well, I think my audience will be X and Y, but you're making that up.
Yeah. I mean, the reason I ask is something that you had said earlier that is something I think about a lot, which is kind of how specifically graphic design writing started as something that was very kind of inside the profession. It was a lot of designers writing for other designers, and I'm kind of interested in how maybe the relationship of the role of the critic to the profession versus to the people outside of the profession. And so I guess I'm how much of your writing, I don't feel like, I'm not sure if there's a question here, or if I'm just kind of articulating this for myself.
I think that I'm happiest writing about design for a non-professional audience. And if professionals like it and are interested in it, that's fine. But I mean, I think that, particularly writing for New York Magazine was a really good
Yeah.
education in how to write about the things that interested me in a fairly mainstream, accessible way. Dwell was, an attempt, successful, I think, to talk about, architectural issues in a mainstream, accessible way without making them dumb.
Yeah.
I don't know. I wrote for House and Garden. I did a blog for House and Garden for less than a year because Condé Nast decided to kill House and Garden somewhere in there. I don't know. I sort of, I much prefer writing for, a general audience, and it's not, it's not a mass audience for sure. It's probably a nerdier than average audience.
Yeah, I was gonna say it seems like it's for people that already have some level of interest. It's not something that just goes in a daily paper for everyone to kind of stumble upon. I imagine it's not for that person.
It could be though. I don't know. It's sort of it's like, I'm not sure the New York Times is an example of anything anymore.
Right.
But the premise of daily newspapers was that everybody was interested in everything.
Yeah, right.
And that idea doesn't exist much because people have, kind of put themselves in really small niches. But I feel like I write for a world in which everybody is interested potentially in everything.
Yeah, I love that.
And I think there maybe are enough of those people out there.
I
could continue to do what I do for a while.
I mean, that leads in perfectly. I just have a couple quick questions just to kind of wrap this up. But I was interested in kind of what you were just talking about with daily newspapers and kind of this audience that, there's enough audience that's interested. And I'm curious. I don't want, this question is going to sound very oversimplified, and I don't mean it to be that way, but as someone who has written really extensively about graphic design and visual culture, and someone who has written about cities and architecture, and I've talked to a lot of designers for the podcast who have talked about wishing that the design discourse was more similar to the architecture discourse, and some of that is kind of, I think, for many years, major newspapers had architecture critics, and just kind of that kind of popular, writing it about it in ways that people outside of the profession would see it. But I also think that a lot of architecture discourse for designers, and I include myself in this sometimes, just as much more theoretical and sometimes deeper and much more interested in the effects of buildings on the landscape, and that often graphic design doesn't have that. And so I'm curious about the differences you've seen in kind of writing for both sides of that, and if there's things from architecture or urbanism or cities that maybe could apply to graphic design writing.
Well, I think the main thing is to think about graphic design as part of the environment.
Yeah.
Part of your daily life.
Yeah.
Like buildings, logos and text and all of those things.
Right.
I mean, I think that the reason that the culture of architectural discourse is so much more, I don't know, I guess serious is because there's that much more permanence and money.
Right.
Maybe not in that order.
Right. Yeah.
I said it a long time ago. Graphic design is still inherently disposable.
Yeah.
And in some ways it isn't. I mean, it seems like some logos are as permanent as any building, and but certainly people take graphics more seriously and notice them and discuss them more than they used to. In large part, I guess, because our environment is often a screen.
Right. I was just going to say that.
That we're like this with a phone in front of our face for half or 2/3 or 98% of the day, and so the graphics and the emojis and, the type and all of that stuff is as much or more
Right.
of our environment than these big physical things that we don't seem to notice.
Right. That leads perfectly into my final question, and I'm very curious, what are the issues or topics that you think graphic designers should be talking about or thinking about more kind of within the profession at this kind of deeper, critical, theoretical level?
I don't think that seriously about graphic design anymore, but I guess if I was thinking about it, just what a reader is, what reading is, whether there are different kinds of reading, if there are good kinds and bad kinds, that comes to mind. And I guess, whether visual language, the persuasive qualities of visual language and how to use those effectively. Long time ago, I did a book with Steve Heller called Angry Graphics about the political protest posters of the first Bush administration. Almost thought about doing a sequel for the second Bush administration, didn't do it. But
that would have been great, though, actually.
The graphics, the political language of graphics is really interesting right now and really important right now, and that's certainly something that's worth thinking about and examining and documenting, because so much of what's out there is pretty ephemeral, and I think it's worth documenting and paying attention to.
Yeah, I know I said that was my last question. It did bring up one more, if that's okay. I'm curious, what are the subjects that you're really interested in right now, whether that's design or not design, that you're kind of...
the thing I'm trying to do that I have not quite figured out how I'm going to do, when the program at SVA that was originally Decrit, it's still called Decrit, nicknamed Decrit, but it's now Design Research, Writing, and Criticism. Started out, I thought that I was going to eventually have a book that was going to come out of what I was teaching.
Interesting.
And how and what I've taught changes. And the main idea is that, the city is a much more potent design museum than any, any institutional design museum. But really, it's about looking and how to look, not just critically, but in a way that's conscious and aware and noticing where you are, what's going on, and why things look the way they do, and sort of evaluating the world around you, not just passing through it. And so I'm sort of finally at the point, I think, where I want to figure out how to write a book that's kind of a handbook to looking at the world.
Yeah, I love that.
So that's... it's sort of a guidebook to the world.
Yeah, I think that's great. I feel like that's very aligned with so much of kind of a undercurrent of a lot of these conversations I have, is that all of this, and it's what we've basically been talking about for the last hour, all these designed artifacts carry with them so much meaning and stories, and that to kind of look at them and look away, you're kind of missing all of this other stuff.
There's, I'm not the first person to say it, but you just sort of see the number of people who walk down the street staring at their phones, and it's like, come on, look up. Look around.
I love that.
So, actually, it's the first time I've phrased it that way, a guidebook for the world.
Oh, good.
So
I'm glad I could help a little bit with it.
It's a good way to think about it.
Thank you so much for this. This was so fun for me. I mean, you're a legend. And have come up again and again, and I had so much fun talking to you and learned so much, so thank you so much for your time.
Okay, well, thank you for coming over.
This was great.
Okay.
This episode was recorded on July 25th, 2017 in Brooklyn, New York. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.